In this second forgetting podcast, we're going to consider cue-dependent forgetting. This is a second example of retrieval failure. That is the idea that a memory trace is in the memory store, but for some reason we are unable to access it. The theoretical basis for this is the encoding specificity principle outlined by Thompson and Tulving in 1971. The basic idea is that when a new memory is formed, we don't just encode the target information, but also the information that surrounds it and makes up its context. Now, by context, we can mean the physical location and the surroundings, or the physical state of the individual who is doing the learning. So, if you're trying to learn this now, not only are you trying to encode the information you're listening to on the podcast, but also the physical environment of the room where you're listening to it, but also the way you feel as well, whether you're happy, sad, well, not well. Tulving's research led him to conclude that this context provided cues which, if recreated, would increase the chances of being able to recall the original information. This gives rise to two important concepts: context-dependent forgetting or memory, and state-dependent forgetting or memory. Context-dependent memory or forgetting refers to the physical environment, the things which are surrounding the memory trace that you're trying to learn. State-dependent forgetting or memory refers to the way you're feeling. It's the emotional and physical state of the person who is trying to do the remembering. Let's consider some research that looks at this. One of the nicest and simplest bits of research is from Abernethy, 1940. He found that students recalled information better in the room where they had learned it. This is an example of context-dependent memory or forgetting, depending on exactly what it is that we're focusing on in the particular example. The physical nature of the room provides the cues to help the recall. So when students recalled in the same room, aspects of the room were providing memory cues to help them recall the original word lists they were presented with. A possible implication of this knowledge is that the best place you could be tested on the information in this podcast would be in the room where you're listening to it right now. A more famous variation of this kind of research was done by Godden and Baddeley in 1975. Instead of students going from one classroom to another, they used groups of divers. The divers learned material either at the surface or underwater. They then recalled the information either at the surface or underwater. So we've got two sets of things going on here. We've got people learning and then recalling in the same place, or learning and recalling in a different place, just like with Abernethy in the rooms. What they found was that when divers changed location between learning and recall, their recall was significantly poorer. Again, the implication is that the location is providing contextual cues which are helping the recall. Another piece of research, which is going to be very valuable to us later on, is by Zechmeister and Nyberg, 1979. It's also just a really cool name. In their interesting variation of what we've seen already, they were able to demonstrate that exactly the same advantage of context could be gained without needing to recreate the original context. The same advantage of recreating cues could be done imaginatively. So somebody didn't have to be in the original room of learning if they could imagine themselves into the original room of learning. We will see later the practical applications of this in terms of eyewitness testimony. Let's consider research into state-dependent memory and forgetting. Overton et al., 1972, found that students recalled better in the same physiological state as when they learned. They achieved this by using alcohol. Small amounts of alcohol were used to manipulate the physiological state of students. Those learning under the influence of alcohol recalled better under the influence of alcohol Those learning without alcohol recalled better without alcohol. Please be careful when you're writing this and talking about under the influence of alcohol. The students were not drunk. Alcohol has a specific negative impact on processes by which memories become long-term, and therefore this would have been a confounding variable in the study. A very similar study was conducted by female researchers Carter and Cassidy in 1998. They found the same results using an antihistamine drug that had a mildly sedative effect to manipulate the physiological state of the participants. Again, participants recalled better in the same state as when they learned material. Finally, and probably only worth mentioning because of the comedy value, Darley et al. 1973 found that participants who had hidden money while under the influence of marijuana were less able to recall where they'd hidden it when they were not under the influence of the drug. Evaluation. One strength of context-dependent forgetting as an explanation of forgetting is that it is supported by research evidence in various contexts. For example, we have the research we've already considered from Abernethy, a highly experimental piece of research, and we've also got Godden and Baddeley's, while still experimental, was actually done in a vocational situation, looking at divers who were training to be deep-sea divers. This is a strength because the ability to replicate a finding demonstrates its reliability and increases the validity of the claim that it's based on. This is especially true when it can be demonstrated in a variety of natural and controlled situations. Another strength of context-dependent forgetting as an explanation of forgetting is that it has practical applications. This can be seen in efforts to improve eyewitness testimony. Research has led to the development of the cognitive interview technique. This consists of 4 mnemonics spelt M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C-S. These are memory aids. Now, one of these is to recreate the context. Witnesses are asked to either physically or imaginatively recreate the context of an event, with the idea that this will provide memory cues and improve their recall. Research demonstrates that the cognitive interview technique is significantly more effective than traditional free recall techniques. One limitation of context-dependent forgetting as an explanation of forgetting is that it's only appropriate in certain contexts and with specific tasks. For example, it is only useful for recall tasks and not recognition tasks. This implies that it's only useful for explaining some examples of forgetting. The reason it might not be useful in recognition tasks is that in a recognition task, the actual item you're trying to remember is placed in front of you. Do you recognise this photo? The actual face that you have to recognise is right in front of you. You don't need any more context than the actual answer itself. The same would be true of a multiple choice test. In a multiple choice test, context-dependent memory shouldn't be an issue because the actual full memory trace is in front of you. Another problem with context-dependent forgetting as an explanation of forgetting is that there is a specific problem with the encoding specificity principle in that it cannot be falsified. In other words, it cannot be demonstrated to be wrong. If somebody is able to remember something, we argue that it's because of the context. If we find they are unable to remember, then we say that they didn't encode the cues and they didn't have enough context. In other words, any result from an experiment still supports the theory. This inability to be falsified is important because Eysenck 1990 identifies falsifiability as a critical feature for good scientific theory.